Welcome to the Copeland Coaching Podcast, where it's all about turning your job search into a slam dunk. Your host is Angela Copeland.
Welcome to the Copeland Coaching Podcast. I'm your host, Angela Copeland. Live on the phone with me today, I have Jeff Goins in Nashville, Tennessee. Jeff is a writer, speaker, and business consultant. He's written 4 books, including The Art of Work. Jeff's books have made it to multiple bestseller lists, including Forbes, The Washington Post, and USA Today. He's also a contributor to multiple publications, including Entrepreneur and Business Insider. Jeff, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Angela.
Well, it's great to meet you. I understand that you grew up in Chicago originally, but you moved to Nashville after college. And I understand that you also spent a year traveling with a band. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what motivated you to move to Nashville. It's a huge change.
Yeah, well, what motivated me to move to Nashville was a girl. The chronology is I graduated college. I had a very practical major in Spanish and religion, and so I decided that the next natural step from that would be to join a band and tour the country for a year. And so, as you can see already, I'm starting to accumulate experiences that are going to result in a pretty successful career. Mm-hmm. And so during that year of touring, right before that. This story is really a story of all the things to not do. Right before I left for a year to tour with this band, 2 weeks before that, I started dating this girl.
Oh, wow.
and actually knew her for almost a year. And then we were friends, and, it was sort of like that, like, do we date or do we not date? We're like, we shouldn't date, because I'm going to leave. And this was all kind of unspoken. Mm-hmm. But then, just like, 2 weeks left to go, I just couldn't help myself anymore, and I was like, okay, let's go out. Mm-hmm. So I started this relationship 2 weeks before I left for a year, and then that continued for a year of basically writing letters to each other. As this is a decade ago, mm-hmm. and so I didn't have a cell phone. There were no internet hotspots, and so I was in a car 12 hours a day driving to the next gig. And she and I would basically write letters to each other, and we did that for an entire year. So you did handwritten letters? Is that what I'm getting? Yeah, no, I'm not talking email. I didn't have a computer. I didn't have a cell phone. None of that. Yeah. So it was very old school. It was like a 1945 courtship.
Aw, that's very sweet. So if she was writing you letters back, where do you send them when you're traveling with a band? Like, how do you get letters?
We would get our mail forwarded to the next location that we were going to be at. And so what I was doing is I was working with a nonprofit, mm-hmm. and we were touring the country, playing for churches, schools, prisons, lots of different groups. Mm-hmm. And so we had an office in Minnesota, the nonprofit did. Okay. So she could send a letter there, and then every week they would forward it to wherever we were going to be that next Monday, basically. And so we would get our mail every Monday wherever our new location was. And we'd go to multiple venues in a week, but every Monday we'd get mail.
Oh, that's very sweet. So how long have you been in Nashville now?
So at the end of that year, this girl, Ashley, told mm-hmm. me that she wanted to move to Nashville. She lived in Illinois, and I was from Illinois, and I was like, okay, all right. Well, I guess I'll move there, because I wanted to marry her at this point. Mm-hmm. And so I moved down to Nashville about 9 years ago, slept on a friend's couch, determined to get a job, and then my parents at this point had moved to Alabama, which was it was as random as it sounds. They moved from northern Illinois to northern Alabama to start a restaurant. Oh. This was my dad's dream. Mm-hmm. And he did it. And so while I was trying to figure out how do I get to Nashville, my parents said, we're going to move to Alabama. And I was like, oh, that's 2 hours away from Nashville. I'll just go with you. So I moved with my parents, helped my dad start his restaurant. And then 1 week I came up to Nashville, and I was like, after being a college graduate, having spent a year on the road, I had about 6 weeks at home, and I was like, okay, I get out of here. Like, I cannot live with my parents anymore.
Right.
I'm a grown man. I need to go do my own thing. And so I determined, I moved up for a week to Nashville and stayed with my friend, slept on his couch, and I was like, I am going to get a job. I have a college degree. I've got travel experience. I'm in Music City. I've played music, and I have a bachelor's degree. This is like a no-brainer, right? I should be able to find a job somewhere. And I said, if I can't find a job in a week, I'm going to leave. And on Friday afternoon, at the end of that week, I was driving out of town dejected because I had applied at 30 different places, and they had all rejected me.
Right.
Even places like TJ Maxx, they had said, no, you're not qualified. We can't take you. So I was driving out of town back to Alabama when I got a phone call on my parents' cell phone at this time. I got a phone call from one of the places that I'd interviewed at that hadn't gotten back to me, and they basically said, hey, can you come do a second interview? And I did, and it was this call center, but it was a telemarketing job, but it was a reason to stay in Nashville and be able to pay my bills. And so I went there, did a second interview. They said, can you come back and work Tuesday? I said, absolutely. And I drove back to Alabama, got all my stuff, which wasn't much. I had $1,300 in my bank account. I spent $1,100 of it on a 1989 Buick Century, got a car, drove back up to Nashville, and have been here ever since.
Wow, that's such a good story. And it certainly shows that you understand how hard it can be to look for a job in a new city.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard. And I have some sisters who just graduated college the past few years, and they have the same wake-up call that I had, which is, wait, I thought college had prepared me for the job market. And it's much harder now than it was for me, but even then it was really, really difficult. And I can totally relate. I mean, you think you've got this experience, you've got this education, somebody should be wanting to hire you, and then you just realize how incredibly difficult it is, and it can be very discouraging. I felt like I'd wasted so much time.
Well, I think so often, especially too, when you're coming right out of college, you've spent quite a lot of money to go to college, and you assume that there will be a return on that investment. So
Right.
it can be really disappointing when it is so challenging. Well, in your book, The Art of Work, you actually mentioned that a recent poll found that only 13% of the world's workers are actually engaged in their job, and that 97% feel disconnected. You actually say, I'm going to quote, most of us have done this at some point, quitting one thing for the promise of something better. And we were disappointed to find that the next job or relationship held the same complications as the one we were escaping. I would love it if you could talk a little bit about this phenomenon, because I've seen this with a lot of job seekers. And I'd love for you to talk about why you think this happens.
Sure. Yeah. So the Gallup Poll, which is a few years old now, they did a survey of the world's workers, and the findings were a combination of these factors that they called engaged and disengaged, and people that were fully engaged in the work that they were doing. It was about 13%, and then people that were disengaged or actively disengaged was like 87%. So roughly 9 out of 10 people are going into work and they either hate their job and they're like throwing wrenches into the machinery trying to like blow the whole thing up.
Okay.
And so that's what actively disengaged means, or they're just punching a clock. And I think what's sad about that is not surprising to us. Like that people we kind of think that people ought to hate their jobs, right? And I'm not somebody who says, look, like you deserve to do what you love, and every day should be, happy-go-lucky sunshine. In The Art of Work, I talk about painful practice and why your calling should be difficult. It should require you to grow. It should be a challenge. So this idea that, like, if you do what you love, you never have to work a day in your life, I just think that's nonsense. Work is difficult. And the challenge of finding a calling is to find that difficult thing that's actually worth growing into, that's actually worth the challenge. And the problem is most people are disengaged from their jobs, not because they're too difficult, but because they're too easy, they're too boring, there's not some challenge. So I think that in our culture we are taught this lie that I should just be happy all the time, and I should get to do what I love and get paid to do that. And I'm not, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, but that's not where you start. You don't start with you. You start with, what is my life trying to tell me about myself, and where can I find a place to add value to the world? This is what employers are looking for, and frankly, this is what we're looking for. We're not just looking to be happy, to do something that's fun all the time. We're looking to do something where at the end of the day we can go, what I'm doing matters. It's making an impact, which means it's not just about me, it's about other people. The reason, because I was one of these people, I was, flakily moving from one job to the next. After, I was in Nashville for 7 months, I quit that telemarketing job because, it was a telemarketing job. Mm-hmm. And I went and worked at a nonprofit. And every 6 months, I would think about quitting that job. And then there was this, voice inside of my head, and often outside of my head, it was my wife's voice saying, don't quit. You still have something to learn here. And so I spent 7 years at this job doing all kinds of things I didn't want to do, acquiring skills that I now use every day as a self-employed writer and full-time entrepreneur. And so one of the things that I found in interviewing people who had found their callings is that there was this period of apprenticeship, mm-hmm. Which often lasted years, not months. It's not an internship. It was a difficult experience where you were having to do stuff that you didn't want to do, but you were growing, you were learning, you were acquiring skills that would be useful later on in your career, in your quote-unquote dream job. And there's this anonymous quote that I love that says, everything that's happened to you in life is preparing you for what's to come. Mm-hmm. I think that is a very different mindset that we ought to have when we approach the work that we do, when we're stuck in some dead-end job that we're going, I could be doing so much more. I think the right mindset to have is, this is preparing me for what's to come. How can I make the most of this so that I can add this new skill to my portfolio of skills that can be an asset to a future employer or to me potentially eventually working for myself.
Mm-hmm. So that actually brings up a good point. I think you actually called it maybe in your book like accidental apprenticeships.
Yeah, right.
I mean, from your perspective, when we do these apprenticeships, should we expect to be compensated in some way or paid in some way? What's your sort of outlook on that?
Yeah, so I'm indifferent to that. I think more important than whether or not you get paid, you should be looking for opportunities to learn. Mm-hmm. And the best way to learn is through real life experience. Mm-hmm. And so, there's a couple of things. One, the old school medieval apprenticeship was an unpaid apprenticeship, but you got room and board and you got teaching, you got free mentoring. And this typically lasted 7 years. The whole process lasted 7 years. You spent 7 years in some artisans or artists' shop, and then you would go out on your own for 2 to 3 years as what was called a journeyman, and then you'd come back home. You'd travel around and basically practice your craft and try to demonstrate that you were good enough to become a master, and then you'd have to submit a work to the guild, and they would say, yeah, this is good. You're a master now. And that piece of work was called a masterwork or a masterpiece. That's where we get that word. Mm-hmm. So that's the precedent. Obviously, we don't have many opportunities like that today. I don't think an internship replaces that. I think more often than not, an accidental apprenticeship is probably, for most people, going to be a series of jobs that are not ideal. Mm-hmm. And you're going to spend 2 or 3 years in these different jobs acquiring experiences and skills and knowledge that you can use in the future. So I have a friend who was working for a church for a few years, and he didn't love it, and he was 23, and he said, I just want to quit and do my own thing. And I said, dude, you don't know how to do your own thing. Mm-hmm. Commit to this position for the next couple of years, learn how to work for an organization. So he did that for a few years, and he got really good at what he did. He moved and started working moved on and started working for a record label, did that for a few years. Now he's working for another organization, and he's kind of top dog, and he's probably a few years away from working for himself, which is his dream. I don't advocate that everybody needs to work for themselves, but this is his dream. It will have taken him 10 years to get there, and that's the norm, not the exception. I was interviewing a full-time writer the other day, and he said, man, it took me 10 years to get here, and that was quick. And he says, I talk to young people all the time, and they go, how do I do what you do? He goes, well, like if you get lucky and you play your cards right, it will only take 10 years. That's not, I'm not, I'm not trying to be gloom and doom here, but we want stuff to happen in like 6 months. And the truth is, it takes time to prepare for your life's work. And one of the best ways to prepare is by leaning into the work that you have to do right now, which could be a day job, or it could be, you're helping somebody. Maybe you want to run your own business or something, and you don't know anything about that. So you're going to help somebody else do that. My old boss and mentor, Seth Barnes, said that before you go chase your own dream, serve somebody else's dream first. And I love that, because you got to see what it looks like in the trenches. And the best way for you to know how to find your ideal work is to serve somebody else's vision first, so you can get an idea of what does that actually look like. And like I said, working 7 years for a nonprofit, leading 3 different departments, over the years, I learned so much about management and finance and marketing and entrepreneurship, and all of those skills that I learned every day, I use one of those now in my current job.
Yeah, absolutely. I really love the perspective that you said it will only take 10 years, because like you said, so often we just want it to happen quickly, and we feel like we've failed if it hasn't happened so quickly. So it's a great point. You also mentioned earlier the idea of happiness and some misconceptions around happiness.
Yeah.
Like, from your perspective, do you think that we can achieve happiness at work, or could we be happier when it comes to work?
So I'm a fan of happiness, for the record. I'm pro happiness. But there's really interesting research about happiness. And basically what it boils down to psychologically is, if you try to be happy, you're not going to be happy, because we are really bad at understanding what makes us happy. Happiness has the same root word as happens or happenstance. It's sort of this idea that, happiness just kind of happens. I think happiness is a byproduct of living a fulfilling, purposeful life. In other words, if you chase happiness, you're not going to find it, because it's like a high. It's like a feeling. But if you chase purpose, you're going to get happiness. So if you chase happiness, you're going to miss happiness, and you're going to miss purpose. If you chase purpose, you're going to get both of them. And I learned this from a guy named Viktor Frankl, who wrote a great book called Man's Search for Meaning. And basically in that book, he says that what human beings crave, the highest desire that a human being has, is not pleasure. We're all caught up in what makes us happy. That's not the highest desire of a human being. The highest desire is meaning. And he said, even in the bleakest of circumstances, and he was a Holocaust survivor, was in multiple Nazi work camps, and he was not feeling great about that experience. He wasn't happy in a Nazi work camp, right? But he found meaning in the most despairing of places. And I think more than happiness, we should be searching for meaning. And what that means is, at times, you're going to feel really good about yourself if you're doing meaningful work. And at other times, it's going to be hard, and you're not going to wake up with a smile on your face. But what will keep you going is this deep understanding that what you're doing matters. So I think happiness is great. It comes and goes. We shouldn't be trying to chase it, because that can lead to a very frenetic lifestyle where it's like, well, if I don't feel like doing it, I'm not going to do it. And there's just lots of good things worth doing, even when you don't feel like doing them. But at the same time, I don't think you should be miserable all the time. So if you want happiness, find something meaningful. Find something that you can do that brings meaning to your life, and I guarantee you, happiness will follow.
That's a great point. Well, so in terms of feelings, another feeling that you talk about in your book is the feeling of fear, and you actually talk about it in terms of the good kind of fear. So for us, when can fear be good versus, like when should we listen to it versus not?
Yeah, so I think there's such a thing as good and bad fear. And I think a lot of people these days say that fear is bad and you just shouldn't be afraid and there's no reason to be afraid of things and just be brave or something. First of all, I think that bravery is not the absence of fear. It's the willingness to act in spite of fear. Really, it's learning to do things afraid. Mm-hmm. And I learned that in doing this research for the book and interviewing hundreds of people, everyday ordinary people who had found their calling, and then comparing that to stories of famous people like Walt Disney and Mother Teresa, and people who clearly made an impact on the world, and we can all agree they got something right. They got something about this meaningful, fulfilling, purpose-filled life right. And what I found is none of them were particularly brave. They often were full of self-doubt and fear, and yet they did it anyway. And so one of the people that I interviewed was a woman named Jody Noland, and she started this organization called Leave Nothing Unsaid. LeaveNothingUnsaid.org, I believe, mm-hmm. Jody Noland. And she wrote a book, and she does these workshops basically teaching people how to write letters to their loved ones before they die. The way that she got into this is her friend Larry was dying of cancer, and he was on his deathbed, and he asked for a pen and paper and wrote some letters to his daughters, went through this surgery, and died a few months later as a result of the cancer. And his daughters cherished these letters that he wrote them, basically saying, I love you, I'm proud of you, here's my wishes for your life kind of thing. Just a very affirming reminder of a parent's love for his child. And they cherished it. Jody saw this, and she was amazed by it. So she started telling people about it, and everybody was like, yeah, that's great, but, who's going to do this? And she's like, well, I guess I'll do it, I guess. And so she started doing these workshops. Well, around that time, her own husband gets cancer and is not going to survive. It's very, very unlikely that he's going to survive. And so she starts pleading with him, begging him. She even resorts to nagging him, in her own words, and he will not write a letter to their daughters. Oh. And what ends up happening is the cancer kills her husband, Mike, quickly. And right after the funeral, his daughter, her stepdaughter, comes up to Jody and says, did he write me a letter? And obviously she's heartbroken, and she says, no. And so she goes, oh, I'm a failure. If I can't convince my own husband to do this, what business do I have convincing other people how to write letters to their loved ones? So she just puts it away. She gets rid of all of her workbooks. She keeps one as a keepsake and starts grieving. And a year later, she gets a phone call from a friend of a friend saying, I'm dying of cancer. I want to write letters to my children. I don't know what to say. Can you help me? Aww. She has one workbook left. Mm-hmm. She FedExes it. She express ships it to them. And the woman gets it, writes the letters, dies. And then shortly after that, she gets a phone call from the family thanking Jody for helping their mom write these beautiful letters to the family. Mm-hmm. And Jody just starts crying, and she realizes, I have to do this. I can't not do this. And she told me that everything flipped for her when she stopped fearing failure and started becoming more afraid of not trying. That's the good fear. The fear that says, I'm afraid of what might not happen if I don't try this. I'm not guaranteed success, but I've got to try. Your calling is that thing that you can't not do. Really what drives you to do it, I think, is the fear that if I don't do this, what's going to happen, or what's going to not happen?
Right. Gosh, that story is really inspirational. That's amazing that you got a chance to talk with her about that in that kind of detail.
She's an amazing person.
That's incredible. Well, so in terms of kind of finding our calling, many people that I talk with are pretty lost. They're trying to find a new direction, and they're not sure where to begin.
Of course.
I mean, for someone who really doesn't know what their calling is, do you have any advice on how we might kind of seek it out?
Absolutely. I think the place to begin is, we talked before about passion and, like what do people want. Frederick Buechner said that your vocation is the place where your deepest joy meets the world's deepest need. And I love that idea But that's not the place to start. The place to start is with what a guy named Parker Palmer, who's an author and activist, says, what he calls listening to your life. And what he says in his book, Let Your Life Speak, is before I can tell my life what I want to do with it, I need to listen to my life telling me who I am. And I think in order for you to find your calling, you need to listen to your life. And what that practically means is you have to look for themes in your past. What are things that you've always done, that you've always enjoyed doing, that you've always been good at? I don't think that your past dictates your future, but it should inform it. So the place that we begin is not with a plan, not with a goal. These are very American things to do, and I'm not anti-planning, I'm not anti-goals, but you can actually succeed at the wrong thing. This is the greatest danger in our culture today, is not to fail, but to succeed at the wrong thing. To set a goal because you think that's what success looks like in America, and you're going to kind of plow forward to achieve that goal without asking yourself the deeper question, no, who am I really? And before I can figure out what I need to do, I need to figure out who I am. Activity follows identity. Before we can do something, we really have to become the someone that we're meant to be. And I think that starts with listening to your life. And it in my opinion, it begins with something as simple as journaling, asking yourself, what is it that I've always been good at, that I've always loved doing? And then asking 3 or 4 friends on the phone, via email, hey, what do you think of me when, you think about me? What word comes to mind? What am I good at? What do I do that, you think is particularly unique? And what you will find is there are things that are very obvious to you that are amazing to other people. Derek Sivers says this. He says, what's obvious to you is amazing to others. And often we don't know what we're meant to do, what we're great at, until we start to get our own skills and talents reflected back to us from those who know us well. And so I think that's where we begin.
Oh, I love that. And the word obvious was the word that was coming into my mind as you were talking. So I'm glad that you touched on that, because I think so often, like you said, we may not realize that we have these really great strengths that other people see in us, and we just don't even pay attention to them. So it is really interesting when those things start to come together and you start to sort of notice.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, you wrote, on a related note, you actually wrote a blog post recently entitled A Simple Secret to Your Success, Teach What You Know. And it kind of ties in a little bit, I think, to what you were just talking about in terms of, kind of doing the things that you have always done and that you're good at. But what do you mean kind of when you say teach what you know? I mean, can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it goes back to this idea of things that you take for granted are not things that other people take for granted. Some of them are, right? Like, I take for granted that everybody knows how to tie their shoes. That's mostly true, at least in the town that I live in, right? It's not the 2015 that was, predicted in the Back to the Future series where you have these self-lacing shoes. But, there's certain things that when I started going down this path of becoming a writer, I thought people knew certain things. So what I do is I write books, and then I also run an online business teaching courses for other writers and creative entrepreneurs now. And all I'm doing is sharing things that I've been doing for the past 10 years that literally I thought, oh, everybody knows this. Everybody knows how to do this. Everybody knows how to start a blog or, write a simple essay or something. And I just thought these were things that most people knew how to do. And when I started sharing, hey, here's how I do this, I got lots of people saying, wow, this is amazing. And I go, really? Because it just kind of feels obvious to me. I think that the greatest contribution that you can make to the world is by sharing a gift with other people. I do that through teaching. I think teaching is incredibly powerful. I'm reading a book right now called The Leadership Engine, where he basically says that, the author says that every leader is a teacher, and the way that you grow in an organization, the way that you grow a business is you become a teacher, and great leaders are teachers. And great teachers are going to empower other leaders. And so I think teaching is powerful. We all have something to share, some gift to share with the world. And really, our challenge is to find what gift is it that feels obvious to me that's amazing to other people. And then how do I just go out there and kind of throw some stuff against the wall and see if it sticks? Mm-hmm. And what you find when you start doing this is your friends, your family members, strangers on the street or on the internet or whatever, they go, wow, that's really cool. I don't know if you know this about yourself, but that's rare. That's unique. I think that's what we're looking for. We're all looking for the thing that we do that not everybody does. And I think we often talk ourselves out of even putting that gift out there because we go, well, I'm not the only one who does this, right? There are other people who do this better than me. That's not the point. The question is, can I find a group of people who need this skill that I have the way that I do it, and nobody else is serving that group of people right now? If you can do that, you basically have a business. You've got a market. You've got demand for a service or product or something of value that you already have to offer. I think this is the way we grow as individuals. I think this is the way that we grow the economy. And I think this is the way that we just make our society better, by sharing things that are obvious to us, that are amazing to other people, that add value, and being generous with those. If you do that, you will always have a line of people out your door that want to employ you or pay you.
Mm-hmm. No, it's true. And it's really interesting when you start to discover, what those things are, and you do start to teach people about them. I find that with working with people who are looking for jobs, there are techniques that I was using over 10 years ago that occasionally I will mention, and someone will say, oh my gosh, that's incredible. It's like revolutionary. And I'm like, really? I thought everyone would do that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's really cool when you can kind of find that. Well, you mentioned kind of throwing things against the wall to see what sticks. Oftentimes when we try new things, we actually encounter failure along the way. And what are your thoughts kind of around failure and its role in finding our path?
I think that failure is the thing that we think prevents us from success. And what I found is it's actually what leads to success if you learn how to fail in the right way, to fail forward, as they say. Mm-hmm. And I think of that as pivoting. So, if you're unfamiliar with basketball, in basketball there's this move called a pivot, which basically means that as you're traveling down the court and you stop and you take a couple of steps, you're done. You're out of moves. If you take another step, you're going to travel and you're going to have to give up possession of the ball to the other team. You're out of moves. So let's say you're traveling down you're dribbling down the court and you stop and there's somebody in front of you. You have no other moves, except you have one sort of secret ninja move called a pivot, where if you have one foot planted, you can move in any direction. You can move in 360 degrees, pass the ball or take the shot, and basically move around your obstacle and continue to move forward. When we fail, that is a pivot point. That is an opportunity to stop and either give up and just go, okay, I'm done, or to turn, in 360 degrees and look at all of the options and opportunities available to you and say, okay, now I need to move in this direction because I cannot move forward, right? Mm-hmm. I can't move in the same direction I was moving. So this failure has to teach me something. It has to open my eyes to other opportunities that I was unaware of. A great example of that is Groupon. Mm-hmm. Groupon started out as a nonprofit entity. And in the first year of business, they lost $1 million. It was a nonprofit. They were trying to use social media to get people to do, vote on causes that they could support. And by the end of the year, they lost $1 million. And one of the founders said, "What if we try to make money off of this?" Right? Because they're failing. They're having to lay people off. It was 2008, I believe, mm-hmm. and not a great time for the economy. So they decided, well, let's try to sell something. Let's try to, make a profit. They changed the whole surface of the business, but the basic process was the same. We're going to get people to vote on something, and they'll just buy it instead of, giving to it. And $13 billion later, we can conclude that was a successful pivot. That's the power of the pivot. We think that when we fail, we're done, right? And when in reality, failure is an opportunity to find an even greater success if you're willing to change direction, become aware of other opportunities available to you and not just tuck tail and run.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, so you mentioned earlier that you went from, working as a communications director at a nonprofit, to, having your own business. And so from your perspective, like, how were you able to make the decision to go from the corporate world to actually starting your own business? Like, what sort of lessons have you taken away from that switch?
Yeah, I think a few. It's easy to leap too soon. A lot of people talk about taking the leap. I did not take a leap. Most of the people I talked to found their calling because they were doing it full time, which wasn't everybody. I don't think that your calling has to be your job, but I do think your job, if it's going to be a permanent kind of fixture in your life, needs to help you fulfill your calling, your purpose in life. And if it's not, if it's an obstacle, then you have to think about an eventual transition. Mm-hmm. For me, it just became apparent that I needed to be a full-time writer. The more I did it, the more exciting it was. The more people listened. The more profitable it was. I was starting to make money doing it. Mm-hmm. All of the things that were lined up there, it was there. And a simple kind of construct for that is to basically ask yourself three questions. Do I love this? Am I good at this? And do people want this? Mm-hmm. And if the answer to all three of those is yes, then that's a good indication that this is something you can move forward with and do full time, because you have all of the ingredients. You've got passion, you've got skill, and you've got demand, which means you love it. So, there's going to be energy there. You can do it well, so you're not going to disappoint people, and because there's demand, you're going to be able to charge for it in some way. And so all those things were there, and I had started writing books. I had written and published 2 books. I was blogging, and I had started teaching this online course. And within about 2 years, I had replaced my wife's income, and she was now staying home with our baby boy, and I'd replaced my income, and it was continuing to grow. And so I still waited because I just wasn't sure. And eventually we had enough money in the bank that we could live on a meager budget for probably the next year before I made another dime off of this new career. And that was a good indication that, I had a good runway, that I could give this a year, and if it doesn't work, I could just go back to working a day job again. Mm-hmm. So I think this is very different than the typical story that we talk about when you kind of quit your job and have your Jerry Maguire moment and storm out of the office. Mm-hmm. I spent 2 years building momentum, and then when I told my boss that I thought it was time to move on, I gave him a 90-day notice because I was a director of a department and said, I want to transition somebody else in. I don't want to leave you high and dry. Part of that was because I wanted to honor, the commitment that I'd made to him and the investment that he had made in me ever since I was 23, 24 years old, helping me grow professionally and continuing to kind of move me up in the organization. The other reason was, what if this doesn't work? I want to be able to come back to him and still have a job and not burn that bridge. And so, it did work out, but I hear so many people use the phrase, take a leap. And when I interviewed all these people who had found their calling, none of them took a leap. What they did was they built a bridge. It took time. In some cases, a lot of time. I met a family who moved to Burundi, one of the poorest countries in the world, Burundi, Africa, and they started a coffee company. I said, how did you get here? They said, well, we took a leap. I said, okay, cool. How long did that leap take? They said it took 10 years. Right? Oh, wow. It doesn't sound like a leap to me. Mm-hmm. That sounds like a slow motion leap. Really, that's building a bridge. It is this slow and sometimes tedious process, but if every day you lay another brick, you take another step, you're going to get to the other side eventually. And that's what I advocate. Don't take a leap, build a bridge.
Oh, I love that. Gosh, you've had so much great advice for our listeners. Is there anything else that you'd like to share with us today?
I mean, I think this has been great. Thanks for having me. One of the things we didn't talk about is the book itself is full of all of these stories, but at the end, there is an appendix full of action steps. A lot of things we're talking about here. So it's basically a free, series of worksheets that you can work through, questions that you can ask yourself if you're trying to work through, do I quit my job? Do I make a transition? Do I stay? Do I try to go work for myself? And then also with the book, we've got basically a free mini course that's 4 videos, and you can get all that stuff just by going to artofworkbook.com.
Great. So if people want to learn more about you or to purchase the book, they should go to, you said it's artofworkbook.com. Is that right?
That's right. That's right, artofworkbook.com.
And are you also on social media?
Yeah, I'm at Jeff Goins, JeffGoins, on Twitter and Instagram, and on Facebook at facebook.com/GoinsWriter.
Great. Well, Jeff, thank you so much for joining me. This discussion's been excellent.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Thanks, everyone, for listening. Tune in next week for another edition of the Copeland Coaching Podcast. And if you haven't already, please be sure to subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher so you never miss an episode.
Thank you for listening to the Copeland Coaching Podcast today with your host, Angela Copeland. Tune in next time to get more great tips on turning your job search into a slam dunk.